I'm a firm believer that there is no day in one's life quite like their wedding day. Call me a hopeless romantic if you will. I just think that day is incredibly special. I mean, it's one of the most unique days that you experience as a human being. You get all dressed up, you stand there in front of everyone you've ever known in your life who took the time out to be there for you on your special day, and you share some special vows with the guy or the girl of your dreams. It's a great day. How could it possibly get any better? I mean, I suppose the only way that it could get better is if you could happen to have some of your closest friends of all time stand up there with you and proclaim their solidarity in the decision that you're making. I was fortunate enough on the day that Mandy and I got married to have some of the best friends that I've ever had in my life stand with me. And before I show you the picture, let me tell you, I tried to find one that was a little less, I'm going to say dorky, but I have no idea where any of our wedding pictures are. My wife knows where they are, and she wasn't sharing that information. So unfortunately, this is the picture that I found. We look like a boy band. I'm not going to say that's what we were going for, but that's what we were going for. But these guys individually represent some pretty significant times in my life. And as I look at this photo, I think about the different ways that these guys have all been there for me. Starting off, the one who's directly in front of me, that is my friend Brian. Brian and I went to high school together at Taylor. We were incredibly tight there. We were in marching band together, and if you know anything about band kids, when you spend that much time with each other, your friendship is a little weird. We had inside jokes together. We have remained tight to this point. Brian and I actually were so tight that people all the time called him Brandon and me Brian and got our names mixed up and all that stuff. We took as many classes together as we could outside of band, but band alone was more than enough. I'm actually really excited because Brian and his wife Cindy are in the process right now of moving back home, and I'm pretty stoked about that my buddy's going to be here and I'm going to be able to hang out with him again soon. I'm actually hopefully going to go see him this afternoon because they're unloading some stuff into a storage unit today. So that's exciting. If anybody wants to help out with that, that'd be great. We're meeting at 1:30 at Jackson Morrow Park, so I'm sure he'd love the help. But Brian and I have been tight together most of our lives. We've got all kinds of weird stories about each other and things that we've done and all that sort of other stuff. We have a handshake that we developed that's our own, and it's long and convoluted and really, really dorky, but it's perfect. It's perfect, and we still do it to this day. We're both in our mid-30s. Anyway, the guy directly next to him who looks like he's plotting how to finally get rid of Superman, that's my friend Greg. Greg and I met at Johnson. We actually met my very first day of Johnson. Before I tell you that particular story, there's something you need to know about Greg. Greg went bald, not balding, full-on horseshoe bald at 16 years old. Like just one day it all poofed out of his hair, or out of his head. Yeah, his hair poofed out of his hair. That makes sense. What little hair he had remaining started to gray shortly thereafter. So when I showed up at Johnson the first day as I'm unloading stuff and putting my room together and all that sort of thing, I've got music playing, and for the life of me, I can't remember what music it was. But in walks Greg into my room, and he goes, "Man, I love this band." And I'm like, "That's great. Are you somebody's dad?" Who's this 40-year-old man just showing up in my dorm room? But Greg and I, still to this day, we call each other, we give each other a hard time about all sorts of different things in life. But I know for a fact that if I needed him right now today, I'd call Greg and he would get here as fast as he could to do whatever it was he needed, or I needed from him. Then there's the guy standing directly next to me. That's Adam. Adam and I have known each other almost since the womb. We went to the same church together. We grew up in the youth group there. We've been tight as long as I can remember. On several Sundays growing up, it was always the question of whose house are we going to? Are we going to your house or my house? Because we would just hang out with each other as much as we could. Adam has been there for me time after time after time after time in my life at the times when I needed a friend more than anything else in the world. If it looks like in that picture that Adam is about ready to plop over and fall asleep, that's because he very likely was. See, when Mandy and I got married, we originally planned to get married in October, but unfortunately Mandy's landlord at the time wasn't going to give her just a 4-month extension on her lease. He wanted her to sign up for a full year, and I didn't see the point in paying for a year, so her lease expired May 30th, so we got married on May 30th. And at that time, Adam was doing a year-long mission trip in Israel. and he wasn't due to get home until July. So I made a whole plan of my own before I ever called Adam to tell him when we were getting married. I made this plan that we were going to Skype him in, have a little laptop sitting on a stool or something like that up there, and I was going to have this really funny moment where when the minister asked for the rings, that Adam would just kind of hand it off to the side, off the camera, and I would just reach behind it and grab the ring. I thought it would be hilarious. When I called Adam to tell him this plan, before I ever even got to it, told him the day we were going to get married on May 30th, he said, "Let me call you back." Now, granted, this is 2:30 in the morning because Israel time and our time is completely different. That was the only time I could reach him. So I was pretty tired already. I didn't really want to wait for a call back. But when he got back on the phone and called me back, he said, "All right, I've booked the ticket. I'll be there." He flew back in on Thursday before my wedding to be there for the bachelor party that we ended up having, and then flew out Sunday, the day after my wedding. Guy didn't even come home for Christmas. Came home for my wedding. That's a friend. I'm honored to have these guys still in my life to this day. But as I look at this picture, I think about something else that's completely different. There's no reason those three should ever be in the same room together. See, they were all friends of mine from different areas of my life. I mean, Adam was my church friend, Greg was my college friend, Brian was my high school friend. Very rarely did they ever intermingle. I mean, Adam was also in marching band, but he went to Clinton Central, and occasionally they would have competitions with us. That would be about the only time Brian and Adam ever crossed paths. Greg went to Johnson and now lives in Tennessee, so there's no way that they would ever meet with each other. And yet, these guys had one thing in common. Me. There was one connective tissue that for one day, these guys were in the same room at the same time, and that was their relationship to me. They don't really have anything in common outside of that, other than a handful of things. But that's just kind of the way that life seems to go for a lot of us, right? We all have these friendships that we have throughout our lives, different people who are friends with us in different locations. You've got your work friends, you've got your friends that you've had your whole life, you've got friends that you make while you're on the plane ride or whatever you do. We all have these intermingling friends, and they don't get together all that often, but they have one thing that's constantly in common, one connective tissue, and that is you. Each one of us have different friends from different areas of life, and only one thing that really binds them together. And when you get those friends together, whether it's for a birthday party or some kind of family celebration of some kind, it's always a little bit bizarre, isn't it? You see these worlds of yours colliding together, and you're not really sure how they're going to mix. There may be a portion of your mind even that knows, I got to keep them away from him. Because those two together, that's a fight. That's a volatile combination of things, because you don't want those things mixing together, because you don't know how those personalities are going to mix that well. Especially when there's only one thing that they have truly in common, and that one thing is you. You got to think that went through the mind of Jesus as he was assembling what would be his final 12 disciples. I mean, Jesus, as he was going around, there were a handful of guys that he would walk up to, and he'd tell them simply, "Follow me," and they would kind of join the ranks. But it's not until we get to our text today, Mark chapter 3, that we actually begin to see Jesus narrow it down to these 12 guys. At the very least, when we look at these 12, though, we kind of picture the disciples always as being very calm and brotherly and just love each other and care about each other. But if you take a step back, and you look at these 12 disciples, there's really no way that you'd ever expect them to all be together. At the very least, if they were all together, it wouldn't be all happy and warm and fuzzy. In fact, it might be pretty volatile. Some of them might want to fight with each other. As we're going to talk about here in a minute, there's one of them that might actively want to kill another. But when we get to Mark chapter 3, verses 16 through 19, we kind of get the final cut. Jesus has been going around. He's collected some disciples, telling them to follow me. He's got a mass of people that continue to follow him beyond this point, but he narrows it down to 12 that are going to be his closest followers. Mark chapter 3, verses 16 through 19 is where we get the final list. It says this: He appointed the 12. To Simon he gave the name Peter, To James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, he gave them the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. Andrew, Philip, and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now again, on the surface level, this just kind of seems like a group of guys. Just a bunch of guys gathered together by Jesus, and he said, you 12, you're going to be the top 12. You're the ones that I'm going to invest the most in. You're the ones I'm going to pour the most into. You guys are going to be there for it all. And we just kind of see this list, and we don't think much about it. But if we dig a little bit deeper, and if we look at their lives before Jesus, we begin to see that this is not a group that should be together. Now, understand, we don't know what all of them were doing before Jesus. The scriptures don't give us things like, Thaddeus and those guys and stuff like that. But they do give us some that they tell us exactly who they were before Jesus. And when you think about this combination of those, it doesn't make a lot of sense. First thing we know for sure is that Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they were all fishermen. They all shared a common bond of what they did for a living. As fishermen, that was their career, that was the path that they took. And we've talked about this from time to time, but I want to reiterate something to you. Fisherman was never anybody's first choice of career. To be a fisherman in this time period, it usually meant that you were probably not smart enough, or at least motivated enough to do anything that's going to make any serious money. It's something that you did because you couldn't think of anything better to do with your life. Fishermen primarily worked at night. They worked throughout the night because at the nighttime level, the water's cooler, so the fish rise up to the surface, so it's a little easier to catch them. So fishermen didn't have a ton of social interaction with people. They didn't develop social skills that you and I might have because they're only around other fishermen. They were known to be coarse and rough and have kind of all manner of bad language amongst them. I mean, the phrase swears like a sailor, that had to come from somewhere, right? And so these guys were just kind of rough to be around. They weren't exactly the pinnacles of personal hygiene. They kind of always smelled like, fish. So people didn't want to be around fishermen in the first place. They didn't want to be around them if they could help it. The only time they'd interact with a fisherman was when they were buying fish. So these four being listed as among the 12 disciples, that's a weird thing already, because no self-respecting rabbi is going to ask a bunch of fishermen to come and follow him, and yet that's what Jesus did. But even if we look a little bit deeper, and we look at James and John specifically, our problematic disciples from last week, oh my goodness, I love these guys. Jesus calls them the sons of thunder. We said this last week, a nickname is almost always earned. It's something that you get because of your actions or things that you do consistently. James and John, they were rough. They were hot-tempered. They had very short fuses. The minorest of any offense would set them off. I mean, last week we talked about a town who simply said, hey, could you please not stay here because we don't want you to stay here because you're going on to Jerusalem. And they were ready to call down fire from heaven. That's a bit of an overreaction, don't you think? But more than that, James and John, they love to provoke. They love to pester. They love to annoy somebody to the point that they're ready to go, because James and John love the fight. There was a good chance that if there was a brawl taking place around them, James or John were the ones who threw the very first punch for it. They couldn't wait for it. These are guys you don't want to hang around, right? I mean, nobody likes to hang out with somebody who's constantly trying to goad them into a physical altercation. And that's who James and John were. And then we dig even deeper, though. There's a name that comes across this list that honestly should jump off at the page to us, but too often we tend to overlook it. It's towards the end of verse 17. It says, verse 18, Simon the Zealot. Now, on the surface, we may think that the moniker, the Zealot, is just simply a way to differentiate him from Peter, right? We know that Peter's real name is Simon, but Jesus gives him the nickname Peter, which means the rock, which is just a really cool nickname anyway. Dwayne Johnson's got nothing on Peter. But the phrase, the Zealot, that should mean something to us, because zealots, in this particular time period, they were a group of major notoriety and even some scandal to them. See, zealots absolutely hated Roman occupation of Israel. That's not deep enough really, because everybody at that time period hated Roman occupation unless you worked for Rome or were Roman, I guess. But zealots, they were a group that was actively trying to do something about it. They were trying to get rid of Rome. They were anarchists. They were constantly calling for the men of Israel to rise up and overthrow Rome, to kick them out of the land that God gave them, to get rid of these Roman heathens so that we can get back to the way that it was meant to be with God. But zealots were even willing to go even further than that. See, zealots oftentimes carried with them a very special sword. Here's a picture of one. Well, it's a picture of a picture, to be honest with you. You'll notice that this sword has a curved tip. It goes up to a curve there. That was by design. It was so that way they could easily, if they hit the mark just right, they could get underneath the Roman soldier's armor to better kill them. See, zealots were trying to get rid of Rome one soldier at a time. They hated anything to do with Rome. If you had even the mildest whiff of Rome on you, zealots hated you. Which makes the inclusion of Matthew even more interesting. See, Matthew, we know from Matthew chapter 9, we know he was a tax collector. Tax collectors worked for Rome. But more than that, Matthew not only worked for the Roman government, but just like every other tax collector in there, he was lining his pockets with some extra cash. See, Matthew was a Jewish man by birth, but he was working for the Roman government. This is the same thing as a friend or a relative deciding to work for your greatest enemy. And the Roman government told the tax collectors, you can take as much money as you want, just give us our cut. So every tax collector that was around that time period was crooked. It wasn't a matter of, is the tax collector crooked? It's how crooked is the tax collector. Matthew was lining his own pockets with the money from the people closest to him. It was legalized theft. It was state-ordained theft. Rome did not intercede unless you didn't pay up your share. Matthew, working for the Roman government, making himself rich off the profit of his own people. All the disciples couldn't probably understand why Matthew was there. They all gave him the stink eye. They all looked at him a little bit funny. They all kept their eyes on him because they didn't know what he was going to do. But Simon probably really hated Matthew. The two of them being in the same spot had to be a volatile situation. You didn't want them intermingling with each other because you didn't know what Simon was going to do. And then there's Judas. See, I've always found the inclusion of Judas as one of the disciples of Jesus is a really interesting one. Because time after time throughout the Gospels, we see that Jesus is more than just perceptive with people. He knows exactly what's going on in their hearts. And so the idea that he brings Judas in, and not only brings Judas in, but gives him a fairly important responsibility amongst the group. Judas is supposed to handle the money bag. Jesus not only invited Judas in, knowing he is eventually going to betray him, but he put him responsible for their money, knowing that at his heart, Judas is a thief. See, John tells us in John 12, verse 6, he says that he was in charge of the money bag and would steal part of what was put in it. This is not a group that we'd ever put together. It's not a group that you and I being able to pick who would be the 12 disciples of Jesus. This is not the group of dudes that we would intermingle together. None of them were guys any self-respecting rabbi would have as his disciples. Some of them might even get some sideways look when they walked into the synagogues. What's he doing here? How could Jesus have that guy with him? Doesn't he know? This is not the mix that we'd expect. These men couldn't possibly have been any more different from each other, and likely, given the choice, would actively seek to avoid each other or worse. The fishermen would be asked to keep their distance from the rest of the group so they could stay downwind of them and try to keep the cursing to a minimum, guys. James and John would constantly be goading somebody into a fight, hoping that somebody's going to take them up on it. Everybody's staring at Matthew, wondering when he's going to make his move. How's he going to try to rob from us today? Simon is looking for a perfect opportunity to kill him. And because everybody's got their eyes on Matthew, Judas takes the opportunity to steal from him. These are the people who Jesus calls his followers. More than that, this group of 12 guys who had nothing in common with each other are who Jesus uses as a model for his church. When Jesus selected the 12, he was saying, this is what my church will look like. This is who my people will be. They'll be a group of people who do not seem to intermix with each other. They have nothing in common, but they have one thing that connects them all together. They're the followers of Jesus. The only thing, at least early on in their relationship, the only thing that brought those 12 men together was Jesus. They had one thing in common, and that was him. And Jesus says, this is what my church will look like. And yet, far too often in the church, that's not the way we act. See, we're not overly welcoming of people. I mean, we like to think that we are, and we like to welcome new folks as they come in here. We'll say things like, all are welcome here, but we kind of have this invisible criteria that we keep to ourselves, something that, you're welcome here, so long as you look like us, you dress like us, you have the same socioeconomical standards as us, you smell like us. See, we want to say that all are welcome, but we have this invisible list of things that you have to do to measure up, to truly be accepted, to truly be welcomed in. We want people to join us so long as they meet that criteria. But that's not what Jesus demonstrated. That's not what Jesus demonstrated throughout his ministry. That's not what Jesus demonstrated solely by his own disciples. See, you and I know I have at least, have been guilty of this. We've been guilty of seeing that person as they walk in, and we know their reputation throughout town. We know the things that they have done. We know the things that they are currently doing. They come from the wrong side of the tracks, or maybe they're dressed in something that we would consider to be less than church appropriate, whatever that means. I'll get on my soapbox some other day about quote-unquote church clothes, but that's not today. We have heard countless stories. You and I both have heard countless stories or actively participated in somebody else's story of them coming to the church hoping to find Jesus, hoping to find his grace and his love and his mercy and his forgiveness, only to be cast out. Maybe not verbally asked to leave, but certainly treated in a way that was less than welcoming, that was less than affirming, that was less than saying, I see you and I love you. And that's what we as the church are called to be. We're called to be a group of people who are intermixed, who come from all different walks of life, who come from all different sides of town. And if the only thing that we got in common is Jesus, well, then that should be enough. Too often, though, we tend to reject those who are different than us, all while still having the gall to say all are welcome. See, I think if you and I were in charge of who Jesus' disciples could be, I don't think we'd pick those 12. In fact, very likely you and I would probably pick guys who pretty much all look the same. Guys who all act the same, guys who all do the same stuff. We'd come up with a bunch of guys who are more or less the same because that's comfortable. That's safe. We want to be surrounded with people who are just like us. But that's not Jesus. That's not his mindset. That's not his heart. That's not his passion. Nah, Jesus took a bunch of guys who had nothing in common and gave them one thing in common, and that was him. And that was enough. Because those 12 men, because of that connection, they had 11 of them went on to change the world. They went on to do things that they never expected they would. They saw things that they never planned on seeing in their lives. They saw the Holy Spirit of God move like wildfire. We got to burn our invisible list of standards and criteria for people to join our ranks. We got to torch it. We got to get rid of it. We got to be warm and loving and inviting of everyone, regardless of where they came from, regardless of what they've done, regardless of how much money they have, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of any little thing that makes them slightly different than us. You don't have to agree with them on everything. There are going to be people who come into this room who have a different opinion than you. That's a good thing. You don't have to agree with them, but you do have to love them. Because that's what Jesus did. Jesus took this ragtag group of weird guys that you never put together, and he told them simply, follow me. See, when all things meet their inevitable end, and all that's left for all of eternity is those of us who've claimed the grace and the mercy and the forgiveness and the love of Jesus, I sincerely doubt we are all going to look the same. I sincerely doubt we're all going to act the same. I sincerely doubt we're all going to have the same things in common. Why would you want that anyway? That's boring. And I don't know about you, but the last thing I want eternity to be is boring. Nah, Jesus demonstrated with his 12 disciples, who he told, follow me. He showed them the words that we find in Philippians 2, verses 10 and 11, where we're told that at the name of Jesus, the one thing that binds everyone together, the one thing that's going to be in common with everyone, at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow. In heaven and on earth and under the earth, every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Every. That means the ones that are different. That means the ones that you and I may have rejected. If the one thing that we have in common with anyone is Jesus, that's enough. Because the very ones that you and I might reject are the very ones that Jesus might say, follow me.